and good to see you all again. I'm sure you all know the agenda. You've all seen the agenda. So we're going to kick off with Gary doing some news. Then we'll do who's next? I think it's Damon, isn't it? I've got so many things going on my screen. Yeah, we've got Damon doing his second part of UX Matters, which I'm looking forward to. And then Ian's going to talk to us about using Node-RED, because he's been using it on his development server to monitor a FileMaker server. Then we got this weirdly named Ask the Experts thing. Gary will tell you more about that. And then we'll just go to the virtual bar. So that's going to be more of a discussion, the Ask the Experts thing. More on that later. Gary, over to you.
Oh, let's see whether this works then. So let's go with this, which I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Yep.
Fabulous. It worked. Hurrah. Right. So a few things in the news. Wasn't a lot. One thing I wanted to highlight was you may have noticed last event was the 60th, which I didn't think it gave enough praise to Jul for all his efforts or what he's done over the last 60 sessions. This is 61. I put the video at the front of the recording, but we didn't really talk about it much at the event. So I just want to say congratulations, Jul, for getting to event number 60, which is flipping amazing. So
thanks, Gary.
Well done to you. To kick off with Claris Engage, since our last event, we've had 4 extra presentations that's come up there, and there's various bits and pieces. If you haven't seen them, go and have a look. I think there's some interesting content in all of them. I kind of liked what Claris did for the Steve Romig one, which is basically, he said, well, what's the key things most companies have problems with? And that mostly is, he said, like a CRM system. So he actually goes through a workshop of creating a CRM system from the start, from the get-go. So, which I thought was quite a nice little thing to say, right, okay, if you're new to FileMaker or new to Claris, how would you go ahead and create something like this? And so that was interesting. All right, probably not for most of the attendees here, but I thought it was a good thing to do. It'd be nice if Claris get behind it and then go, look, we're doing a series of quick little intros of how to do something. I know they'll say they got the starter solutions, but it was so much better to have someone go through from start to finish and show you what they were doing, why they were doing it, and how they were doing it. It was almost a training document, which I thought was really good. Maka did a really good thing on developer resources, the community and so forth, which I know Penny's on the panel in January for that as well. So again, if you're looking at areas of resources for recruitment, resources for content, questions, answers, the community's mentioned a lot in that, but it's worthwhile looking at. Katie did a presentation on as an individual that works in a business and how they were using Claris as basically a showcase. It was really good because she highlighted the areas of what she's doing with Claris Connect, which was really good. And it gave an insight to me where Claris Connect is how it's being used by some people and how they're using the tools that are available. I don't really use Claris Connect. We don't use it at all in what we do, but it's opening my eyes a little bit to some of those automation processes. So. And security and compliance was the last one that was on there from Andrew Ricates, which was really, really good. There's the one I'll be honest, I'm going to focus on for 2 seconds because it's in my topic of conversation. And it was basically a session, an hour session about how Claris is doing compliance, security, in some respects, a little bit of a look under the hood of what is going on with Claris and where they're working and what they're doing. The panel was set up with the following attendees, of which we have one of them here, Chris. Hello. But I thought it was a really good session. I have to say, I think Chris was the one that scared the most out of them about what's happening in the industry. So well done for scaring them and making them realize and stand up and say, look, they've got to address these issues. But I really did think it was a good idea of what they were trying to do there. They're saying about being ISO accredited for Claris Connect, various bits and pieces, and how they've gone through that accreditation for ISO 27001 and what they're doing for SOC 2, which is a audit and it's basically a governance criteria that they have to then go through those checks and make sure they're doing that. Obviously, that's focused heavily on cloud and Connect because it's their offering in the cloud. They can't really do that on premise. It's up to us to do that. But it's a worthwhile exercise to listen to that, because if you've got clients that are on-prem, it's something that if you ask that question, well, what's the sensitivity of information? So if that information is not that sensitive, you could argue, does it really matter? Do I need to worry about it so much? You should be concerned about security, yes, but there's a point of, if you're going to go to that level of accreditation, you've got to have a reason for doing it. So if you have got contracts or any information, then that could be an area where you need to think, well, okay, there's some hoops I've got to follow through with this and go through. So a worthwhile exercise. It's an hour of your life, but it's an hour well spent, I think, to watch that one and have a look. So.
There was actually a point I was trying to work back into that conversation at the end, and I didn't quite get to it. And that was that ransomware is an act of extortion, and they have two levers they use. One is they lock up all your stuff and don't let you use it until you pay the ransom. And the other one is that they exfiltrate your data and threaten to release it if you don't pay the ransom. Yep. And for that second case, it's really easy to dodge that bullet just by using encryption at rest, because I've yet to hear of anyone breaking into an encrypted at rest database. And so if you do that one step, and even if you get exfiltrated, I think you're covered from that second, angle of attack that they have, but I didn't quite fit it in.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is exactly one of the things is I've done talks on this, and we struggle with this because we've got to get to internally ourselves. We've got to get to that point where we've got to say, right, we've ticked all these boxes, and that is the first one that we put on the list. Is well, if you encrypt all your databases and open up encrypted, that'll do. If anyone nicks that database or exfiltrates it, or even your backups, they're all encrypted. If anyone opens it, they don't have that encryption key. They can't do anything. So at least you go, well, even if I've got a load of container data, right, don't store your container data non-encrypted. Please don't do that. So that's pointless. You've got an encrypted database. Now the contents of it is now freely available in plain text. Don't do it. They're the little triggers. They're the little things. And Chris, you're absolutely right. I think if you turn that on, you can almost go, well, at least my FileMaker solution is safe. With the exception of the log file, which I could argue the fact that that's not encrypted, but I don't know what that's going to give them. It might give them routes to other areas within your infrastructure. That's about it, but there's very little. As far as the actual data is concerned, you're covered. So I think that's one of the key takeaways, definitely. Other thing I wanted to say is pause and error has happened. And I know I've heard the feedback of it. It was very good. Everyone liked it. Everyone enjoyed it. I just wanted to mention there's a podcast, the Context podcast has got 3 sessions on what pause and error, what it was this year, how it was working, what people got out of it. There's a couple on, there's a whole session with Todd Geist where he's going through the stuff of what he's covered at some of the sessions and what he's learned at some of the sessions. And then there's 2 more about people's user journeys, their stories of attending and so forth, worth doing. I'm certainly going to put my name in the hat for hopefully attending the next one that there is and try and make the journey. Hopefully, all willing, I'll be able to. So the next thing on the agenda was a wow moment for us. The wow moment is basically with Jul, something that we found. And basically, because of that, we had an area where Jul actually blew our minds that we didn't know of. And I want to basically highlight, if you've got anything that you think you see that other developers or other people have mentioned, then let us know, because we want to feature it here. Because our wow factor was, I did not know you can create a let statement within the data viewer while you're debugging a script to then set a parameter. I just did not know you could do that. So I've been halfway through debugging very lengthy scripts and then finding out that all of a sudden I just couldn't get that parameter available. So then I go back, edit the script, set a phantom parameter in there that I'd normally step over. I just create a let statement, which Jul told me about, which I did not know you could do that. Just create a let, set the variable, whatever you need it to be, and then just basically run that. All of a sudden it's in your list of variables for your script to pick up. So I thought that was brilliant. So absolute wow factor. I didn't know if you didn't know. If anyone doesn't know that, please contact Jul after this, because he'll tell you more details of how to do this, because it's not
I can't really claim credit for it. I mean, I picked it up from someone else, so it's just me disseminating knowledge I've picked up elsewhere. And I'm glad it blew Barry's mind.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's always pleasing to find something that Gary doesn't know.
Cool.
Yeah, but do talk to me if you want to. I'm happy to talk about it at any point.
And basically the last bit of it, what I wanted to do is mention about supercharging systems. This is something that you all know of, SQL, Java, and various other things you've got. I just wanted to highlight one other area as Click that I use, I'm an advocate for. It's something I was doing. Those are the tools we use. You can accelerate your processes. You can use those to accelerate things. I did a little test in something that I've been working on in Click, that I was trying to work a way of speeding up our import of our mass amounts of data. Now, these terminals, these processes you can run, like Perl, for example, is phenomenally powerful. You know how to write Perl script, and you can use that, and it's blisteringly fast. But this is a scenario of what we did. So the power of Click, quick tease, I will do a full session on this, I think, because it's worth doing. So if you can see the screen now, so what you've got here is a log list of functions and tasks that we're running. You can see the dates on these are quite old, but the starting point of this was 6 hours to process the data. It's a vast amount of data we're moving. It took 6 hours in FileMaker to move it around. I then messed with doing summary imports to then get that time down. I then messed with the scripts a bit further, and I've got it down. I got it down to 45 minutes. Now, yes, that was 2017, and I was fine with that. It then started to creep up, as all systems do, and then it got back up to just over that hour mark. And it's like, I don't want it to be an hour. I don't have enough time in the evenings to process all the things we do in an hour. So I looked at this and I thought, well, how do I do it? So I looked at what Click could do to generate some data. And I created basically a way of summarizing. It's in effect, if you know SQL and you've got a SQL server and you've got the power of SQL Server, it's in a way of doing summaries within SQL. So I run a process in Click, which takes less than 30 seconds to output a file, which is already summarized perfectly. And then when I bring it into FileMaker, that's the outcome of the result. I've now got a process that used to take 45, 50 minutes to run, and it's done in 5. So this is like we've now moved all of our 90 processes over to Click first to do stuff, but I'll go in more detail about what I've done with this and how it works. We'll discuss more in the virtual bar when we go through some things. So that's the news. And the one thing I wanted to add is on the website is a Q&A session that Jul mentioned. If you have a question you want to ask, and we're going to try and publicize this a bit more, it's something we're trying to do is, if you've got a question, you go, well, I don't know how I got this portal to sort properly when I'm doing lots of records. If I've got 1 million records in a portal, how do I, don't put a sort on it? Stuff, any weird and wonderful questions. You may all know those questions and answers, but it's that thing of if you've got a question you want to ask the group or put it out there, right, which is faster, this or this, let's try and create a session for that each time we have this. And we're always going to have this Q&A session on the site. So just post a question there. And then basically we will try and get the group to answer it, because I'm not saying me or Jul will understand what the hell the answer is. We probably just go, we don't know. But I'm hoping there's enough bright people here to do it. And it goes on the video, it goes on that thing that everyone else then learns. So it's something we're trying to do. So hopefully that will work. But please post some questions and got some ideas. I posted one earlier. I think Jul's posted one as well. So we'll bring that up in our questions and we'll see where we are from there. Okay. Over to you guys.
Okay, Damon, are you ready to rock and roll?
Yep.
I'll leave it over to you then.
All right, so that's looking good. Right, so this system I presented at the last meeting, and it's for the party model, and it's around organizations and contact, where you can have an organization playing the role of a customer and a supplier at the same time, having contacts working at multiple organizations, both simultaneously and over time. And as I built this as a prototype that I was using, it's easy for me to just work through everything and know how everything works. But to then start to turn this into a system that I can show to users, especially around the admin side of things, where we have the ability of creating declarative roles of the customer and the supplier, going into contact mechanisms and having 3 levels of categories, having usage, purpose for contact mechanisms, and then again for addresses. For me to use this, it's really easy because I know exactly how it works because of having built it. But to try and pass this to a user where they're going to be possibly coming in every month, maybe every 3 months, maybe every 6 months to actually use this, I thought this isn't something that I could give to a user because it's too difficult for them to use. So tonight's presentation is around being able to take what I've got here and turn it into something that users would be able to pick up and use relatively easily. So I'm going to focus tonight on something called user stories and story mapping. And this is a technique that's come up through agile software development. And so I'm just going to bring up this quote here, which comes from Mike Cohn from a book called User Stories Applied. So extensive upfront requirements gathering and documentation can kill a project in many ways. One of the most common is when the requirements document itself is a goal. And the requirements document should only be written when it helps achieve the real goal of delivering software. So what is a user story? Well, it's just a short, simple description of a particular feature being told from the user's perspective. It doesn't contain any technical details or jargon because that's of no use or interest to the user. So a framework for writing these stories is something called Invest, which comes from a guy who's Bill Wake, I think his name is. And that's the article that he wrote, linked there, that you have in the presentation afterwards. So Invest means independent, and it means that stories need to stand alone from each other. But while being independent, they can also be intrinsically linked to each other, where you might have a story saying a user can log into the system and a user can log out of the system. They need to be negotiable. And so user stories, they really facilitate having communication or verbal communication with clients. So rather than having a written document where you're going to be going into obviously the details and the requirements of what a system's going to do, actually talking it through with the client is actually making it easier, and being able to negotiate different stories and what value they're going to bring to the client is important. So being valuable, as you work through a list of user stories, you can talk to the client about how valuable they're going to be to them, or what value they're going to gain, both as a business and as users. And for something that's not going to be of high value, it's easy to either give it a low priority or discard it altogether. They need to be estimable, which means that you can actually estimate the amount of time and effort that's going into developing those user stories. They need to be small enough that you can look at a small piece of development, whether that be an hour's development, half a day, or a day. If they're going to be too big, then we would call them an epic story, which you would then break down into smaller stories. And they also need to be testable, so that once you have a user story, you want to have the users be able to write their user acceptance tests that would then be obviously performed by them when you release the software to them at the end of an iteration, which I'll go into a bit later. So why use user stories or write user stories? Well, they force a shift away from the written documentation, as I mentioned earlier, into having verbal discussions and being able to talk about things that everyone can understand, and values placed on that communication between developers and users. It provides greater understanding through rapid feedback cycles of having those communications. They're comprehensible by both developers and users. They're of a good size for planning along with other work that you're doing. And they work well with iterative development, where you can start with a high-level user story. You could develop that as a minimum viable product, and then you can iterate on that over time by building in extra functionality into those features. So writing user stories, you would start off by defining the users of that system, which I would expect everyone would be doing upfront before you actually do any other work on the system. You need to, as a developer, understand who's going to be using the system. Designing the customer journey. Now, this is more about having the customers of the business, not being customers of you as a developer. So this is going to be where they'll have a process of the customer coming in as a lead, working through to actually becoming a customer and being retained as a customer over time. And a customer journey is something that should be something the business does themselves, not something that we may be involved in that, but it's really a task for them because they know their business, and whether they develop it themselves or work with an analyst or someone who can do that with them. I don't think it's something that we should take on ourselves, but it could be something we're part of. So after the customer journey, it's about creating a story map where we can start to map out how these stories are going to come together, and then to start writing those user stories. Then it's planning the release, and the release is going to be, once you've finished that particular piece of work, you're then going to release that to the customers, first of all, as an iteration where they're going to test the development that you've done. And then once they've accepted that development, you can then release the software to them. And so you will plan out a release where it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be 6 months. And within that, you'll have the iterations that you'll develop for them to test. And then once you've done that, you'll go ahead and start developing the user stories as part of your development. So customer journeys, I've got a few examples here that I found, and it's really about stepping through that process, as I said, about the customer of the business in terms of how they become aware of the business and go through to becoming a retained customer. So this is one that's about a cable digital television provider. And so it's just giving you an example to show you what they actually look like. So I don't know what's going on here. I'm not able to move to my next slide. Okay, that's better. So just another example here, just going through a B2B journey. And in the center, you can just see the various flow or various aspects of that journey. Another one here for a medical practice of the patient's flow through the practice. And then another one here for students' field trips. So that's why I don't think it would be something I would want to take on. You know, being involved in it and going through how the system you're developing will work within that flow, I think is fine. But actually to come up with this kind of thing, I'd rather actually leave that to somebody else. And then if you do need to actually be involved in that, then here's a template that I'll make available at the end of this as a PDF. This comes from the Nielsen Norman group, where you've got Don Norman as part of that, and Jakob Nielsen. Don Norman wrote the book, The Design of Everyday Things, that you may be aware of. So creating a story map, we start with writing the high-level stories which describe the user's activities. And then under each activity, you'll then break down those high-level stories into user tasks. And these could be called epics, where they're a large story and you'll break an epic down into the actual user stories. So from there, planning out the development releases. So a release is a version of the system that you're going to release to users after they've accepted the development. And within each release, you're going to have iterations, which are also known as sprints within Agile development. And so this is going to be a development cycle where you're going to have a group of user stories where the functionality will be developed to completion and handed over to users for user acceptance testing. And then within each iteration, you will have user stories, whether they're epics that are going to then be broken down into 2 or more stories, or you're just going to have a list of user stories that are going to be developed. And then a backlog is known as a list of user stories that you haven't actually put into any iteration or release at that time. And you can just pull those out and say, okay, for the release that we're now going to work on, these are what you're then going to agree with your client as to what you're going to develop as part of that release. So a release is going to describe high-level functionality. You'll include the length of development, whether that could be a week, a month, 3 months, or so on. The number of iterations or sprints that you'll have within that release. And then iteration velocity is the speed of development. So you could say for one iteration, it's a number of things that you can actually get done and develop within that time. So to talk about that a bit more, each user story that you have, you'll describe the amount of effort that is going to go into that story. And two ways of doing this is to apply points to each story or to use t-shirt sizing. So if you're using story points, you could say that 5 is a large amount of development, 1 is a small amount of development. And so if you have a story that's at 4 points, that's going to be double the amount of work of a story with 2 points. So when you want to prioritize development, you'll look at the iteration velocity estimate and say, well, how much can we get developed in one iteration by looking at those stories and looking at either the t-shirt sizes or the story points and saying, okay, well, if we can get in, say, 15 story points of development, then that's what you're working with within one iteration. And so you'll then look at the story size estimates, and as you're putting the user stories into an iteration, you'll then make sure that you don't exceed the iteration velocity. So looking at what's a good user story and what's a bad user story, at the beginning I mentioned about you don't want to include anything about the technology. So having a good user story, it's about what the user is going to get and the value that they'll receive from it. So good user story being a user can create an organization, or an administrator can administer contact mechanisms. And I'm using those examples from the party model prototype that we'll go back into in a little while. So bad user stories would then be going into the technology, because a user's not going to actually care what version of FileMaker is being used or what plugins you're going to use in that, or the technology behind how the system is going to integrate with web services and other systems. So I mentioned about having epics, which are large stories that you want to break down into smaller stories. So this example is a user can add an existing address to an organization. And this could be an epic, or it could be a story. So within that, we've got a user can open the address picker list in a new window. A user knows which organization the address will be added to. They can search for an address within the picker list. They can filter addresses within the picker list. They can then select an address, and then they can add that selected address to the organization. And also, if they don't want to go ahead with this, they can cancel the address picker list. So is this a piece of work that's going to really be an epic where it needs to be broken down into multiple stories? Or is it small enough that it's actually just one piece of development that is a single story? Well, one way to look at this is to look at the user acceptance tests, because if we can rewrite this as tests, we can actually say, well, it is a small piece of development. And so rather than this actually being broken down into multiple user stories, we can actually rewrite them as tests. So if we take the user can open the address picker list to be the address picker list opens in a new window, well, that's the user accepting that once they test it, they can see, yes, it does do that. So they're accepting that development. And then we can work through the rest of these as tests. And I would then argue that if it's small enough, I would actually write this and keep it as a single user story rather than actually breaking it down into separate stories. And so what this does is when you have it as a list of user acceptance tests, it informs us as developers when we have actually finished the development of that user story. So some example user stories for the prototype that we're going to look at in a minute. So a user can create an organization, a manager can delete an organization, a user can create an address for an organization, they can add an existing contact point to an organization, being a telephone number or an email address. A user can create a customer declarative role for an organization, and that could also be the supplier declarative role as well. So for the administration of the prototype, a system administrator would then be able to create a declarative role, they can update a contact mechanism usage, and they can delete a contact mechanism purpose. So now to go back into that system, going to go in and look at the prototype and then look at how to develop a story map and then the user stories around that. So to come back in here then, so I'm going to focus mainly on the administration, but obviously we've got the organizations in here where we can create addresses, add existing addresses, contact mechanisms. We can then put them into the declarative roles of the customer or the supplier. We can create new contacts and we can add existing contacts. And then on the administration side, we've got those declarative roles. And then under the contact mechanisms, we've got the categories. And so we've got the types of contact mechanisms, electronic addresses and telecommunications numbers. And then once we go into those, we've then got the third level of categories of email, website, Skype, etc. So what I wanted to do is to look at this and say, how would we actually go about building a story map and then the user stories to make this easy for a user to come in and use. So I'm going to jump into OmniGraffle now. And so I've got a key here for building a story map. So the user activities are the overall things that the user is going to do within the release that you're going to develop. And then within each user activity, there's going to be multiple user tasks. And these would be the epics that you would then break down into the user stories. And then within the user stories, we'll then have the user acceptance tests. So in this first version, I've got the organization management, and I've got the party model administration. So jumping back into FileMaker then, so the organization management will be the things we can do in here. And then the party model administration are the things that we're going to do on the admin screen here. So first of all, we've got maintaining an organization. And within that being an epic, we would then have a breakdown of that into these user stories of a user can create an organization, they can update an organization, delete an organization, create an address, add an existing address, create a contact mechanism and add an existing contact mechanism. And then within maintaining the organization's contacts, they can create a new contact, add an existing contact and deactivate a contact. So deactivating the contact would be when they leave the organization, you can then make them inactive. You wouldn't delete them because you want the history of them. And so you would keep them there as an inactive contact. These are obviously not the only things that you'll be able to do, but it's a starting point for developing this into the user stories. So then under the party model administration, we've got the maintaining the declarative roles. So going back into FileMaker, we've got those declarative roles here. So we can create a declarative role, we can update a role, and we can delete a role. So we've got those three things here. So we can do a new role there, we can then edit the role, and then we can delete the role. So I'm looking at this, is this actually a breakdown of an epic, or are these actually, is this actually just one user story on its own? So from here, I think it's actually a single user story because the amount of work to go into developing those three things is small enough that they don't need to be individual user stories. So to break this down then, I've got the user story of maintain a declarative role, and then I've written the user acceptance tests to then say a declarative role is created, declarative role is updated, and it's deleted. And so the user would then sign off on those once they actually get to test this development. So that's basically demoing both of those. Any questions there around the story map?
Damon, as you are fleshing out the user stories, do you find that sometimes you're in a situation where you need to describe what users are not allowed to be doing?
Yeah, I think you can describe that within the framework of what you're doing. I don't know about it being a user story that you would write in terms of being added to a story map and the iterations. I think that you're basically agreeing what can't be done but what you want the user stories to be is what you're actually going to develop. So if you included it as a user story, then you might look at that and think, well, do I need to develop that? So there could be some confusion around that. But I think certainly within that, you could, where you would have a list of the user acceptance tests, you could also say within that, this is a list of things that you cannot do when you're doing this.
Okay, and in the same fashion, would you say that a lot of the business rules would end up as acceptance tests?
Yeah. And so where I wrote the user story of a system administrator can do this, that's where we've broken down the user roles so that we can, by reading a user story, we can see who is able to do something in there. So we're actually incorporating business rules into the user stories, because we could say a user can create an organization and they can update an organization, but they can't delete it, and a manager can delete an organization. So we're kind of incorporating the business rules within there. Okay, so let's jump back into this now. Okay, so I've kept the user stories quite simplified, and this is something that comes up in agile developments, of having this user needs statement where, as a type of user, I want to be able to do something so that I get this benefit from it. And so as part of this prototype, I've written this: as a salesperson, I want to create a new organization quickly and accurately so that I can start their customer journey and progress towards my monthly targets. So we can flesh out the user stories as these user needs statements, but I don't see that there's an issue with actually keeping them even simpler if you want to. So that's basically the end of the presentation. There's a number of resources that I've included here where we've got some books. So there's Extreme Program Explained. This is really the first book, I think, that covered user stories. And then User Stories Applied is a good book, along with User Story Mapping, that really go into detail of this. Agile Estimating and Planning covers the agile development process and also goes into user story mapping and user stories as well. And then Change by Design is written by Tim Brown, who heads up an organization called IDEO, which is a big UX design organization. So there's some customer journey resources here to really go into looking at those examples that I showed earlier. There's a good one by the Nielsen Norman Group, and Boag World, their one is good as well. Then story mapping resources. The user story Wikipedia article is pretty good. Mapping user stories in Agile by the Nielsen Norman Group, that's very good. And the author of the user story mapping book, Jeff Patton, his website has got some further resources and PDFs on there. Then some user story resources. Again, the user story Wikipedia page has some good information on there. Nielsen Norman Group has got some good information on that article there. Funnily, the UK government's website has actually got a decent write-up of user stories. And then the UX design website has got another one there. And then just finally, for the overall agile development process, there's a good history of agile development. And if you want an overview of agile, then the Agile 101 is good. And then again, Wikipedia's agile software development article is quite good as well. So that's it. I'll take any questions.
Hey, I'll jump in with a thank you again. I enjoyed your previous part one and the sequel part two today. So declarative role. So I did read the Len Silverton book twice. Very much enjoyed it. The epicenter of all this is, in my mind, the party, and then there's this role. And I have to confess that I kind of cheated a little bit in the stuff that we do. We're sort of flattened it out a little bit with roles. Classic example, customer supplier or customer vendor. either word works, right?
Yeah.
Where I've instead of it being a relational structure, it's just checkboxes. Kind of goes way back before the book. Works pretty good. But I suppose that could also be done with more table structure, like if you have an organization or any kind of party where you have a relational structure. This is a customer, it's a supplier, it's a family member, it's a friend or whatever, you know, establishing different roles. Anyway, I think that's an interesting decision to be made in terms of architecture, whether you know, FileMaker maybe flatten it out a little bit, kind of, you know, cheat, if you will, or whether you just go full on relational.
Yeah, definitely. The way that I've developed the party model so far is when I look at the declarative roles, if I'm going to actually have a customer record, then there's going to be information that's going to be stored there that is only relevant as a customer or as a supplier. And then off of there, you can then drill down into quotes and projects and invoices and so on for the customer, and then purchase orders and purchase invoices for the supplier. So I think it would, there are the different levels of the party model. So this is what Len Silverstone calls the level 3 declarative pattern. And so I think it really depends on how you're working with the client in terms of their business processes and business rules as to, does it need to go as far as having a separate customer record and a separate supplier record? Or can you cheat, as you've said, by having a checkbox and storing all of that data within the organization record? So I think, yeah, it would just depend on the project for me as to which way I'd have to go with that.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. It depends. And let me just sneak in one more thought, which is not really a question, but a thought that I've been thinking about is, in FileMaker, what's the cost of an empty field? Like, for instance, if you do cheat and flatten it out and you have customers and vendors and different fields, aka attributes, you know, and they're empty, it seems from what I've heard from the under the hood from the FileMaker Claris engineers that those empty fields are inexpensive. And so I've been wondering, like, what's expensive when I'm doing architecture? How expensive is a global field? How expensive is a summary field? How expensive is an unstored field that's not shown on the list? I think they're all kind of free, but it's still a decision that gets back to how you want to implement the party model. So anyway, thanks again. I enjoyed it. I had fun.
Thank you. And so part 3 of this will go from taking the story map that we've got here into actually developing some wireframes of how a user can very easily go from having something that's quite complicated in maintaining this to how they can actually go and use something that's very simple where they're not going to use it regularly, so that it does a lot of hand holding and it's more of an onboarding process that they would use, because it's almost like they're using it afresh for the first time when they, you know, if they're only going to use it every 6 months. So it's very much that it's going to ask lots of questions and walk them through the process rather than just leave them looking at this screen and thinking, what the hell do I do with this? So that will be part 3.
That's great, Damon. That's really interesting, fascinating stuff, and definitely thought-provoking. Has anyone else got some questions? Any questions on that they want to ask Damon about? I'm certainly looking forward to part 3, by the way, Damon.
That's all I was going to say. I can't wait for part 3, really. Close the chapter. No, really good, mate. I agree with Jul. It provokes thought. We don't use it, but it's certainly making us realise there's areas where we could. So that's the point of it. So I can see it having huge benefits. So.
And I'll make these documents available to you so that you can have a look at these OmniGraffle documents. So I'll give you the OmniGraffle document if you have that software. Otherwise, I'll make it into a PDF. Cool. And the presentation with all the resources and links throughout. You have access to as well.
If you're happy with that, we'll put it up on the site.
Yeah,
that'd be great. Could you post the links in the chat for anyone who can't wait? That would be if that's easy.
Sure.
Will you at some point?
Yeah, I can do that. Yep.
Great.
Yeah, no problem.
Anyone got any more questions for Damon? or thoughts or ideas or anything? No. Again, I guess you probably hang around for the virtual bar for a bit, won't you, Damon?
Yes.
Yeah. So if anyone's
Yeah,
got
definitely.
anything that occurs to them in the interim, please just jump in and ask Damon in the virtual bar.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Many thanks, Damon. Big
Cheers.
round of applause. Ian, how are you doing? Are you ready yet? You're next up.
I'm next up. Okay.
You ready to hit us with it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, over to you.
Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. Right. I'm gonna start off just with a fairly quick PowerPoint presentation. Then following on from that, then I'll kind of jump into how this thing actually works with an example. So essentially what I'm going to talk about is how to do something useful with FileMaker log files using Node-RED and Rabbit message queue. So I'm going to make a couple of assumptions here. Other people have done some really good intros to Node-RED. So John, I know a couple of not too long ago, did a really good intro to it. So I'm not going to go into immense detail on that, but I'll go into should be enough detail. Yeah, so basically, FileMaker tends to stick their log files down somewhere to store them as text on the FileMaker server. And it's not terribly useful there unless you get them somewhere else. There are some other tools that you can use to work with the logs to real-time reporting. So I'm going to talk about a different method, basically kind of I suppose a home-built method using Node-RED. So at a high level, what we want to do is we want to read those log files, do something with them so we can get them to, in my case, I'm going to add them to another FileMaker database, which is running on a different server, and maybe then email or notify, things like that. And the way we're going to do that is basically by having some type of message producer, which reads the log files. And in this case, that's going to be Node-RED. We're going to send them to a message queue, which we're going to use RabbitMQ. And then we're going to send it to message consumers that are going to do something with it. In this case, the message consumer is going to be, again, Node-RED, but it's going to be a different instance of Node-RED. So a bit more detail. What we've got is let's look at my local network, and we've got AWS. On my local network, I've got a Mac Mini running a FileMaker server and a Node-RED instance. I've got several Raspberry Pis around the place that are where we're running RabbitMQ on one of them, and then we're using Node-RED as well, running on Raspberry Pi. And on AWS, we've got another FileMaker server, which is going to receive the contents of our log files. The Python stuff, I've actually changed. That's no longer running on Lambda, so we're not going to be going into that today. But essentially, what you can do is you can have multiple consumers of what's coming out of RabbitMQ. So why RabbitMQ? What it does is it allows us to do asynchronous processing of information that it's storing. It supports communications between different systems. Sorry, hang on. There. Basically, it's a high performance open source message queue. It's highly fault tolerant, and it's really scalable, supporting clustering. To be honest, with the volume of data you've got coming from FileMaker, it's highly unlikely that you're going to need any kind of scaling. It's going to be more than capable of dealing with that. So why do we need a message queue? Basically, we want to avoid doing these resource intensive tasks right now. We don't want to wait. Fundamentally, we want to make these things asynchronous. So what we're doing is we're sending the task as a message to the queue. Then we've got other computers, workers that receive tasks from the queue and they do them, and you can scale, you can add more workers. So you can scale a system quite dramatically this way. But it's not necessarily just tasks. You could also send notifications of events. In this case, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to treat each line in the FileMaker log file as a representation of an event that's happened. So what we're going to do is we're going to tail the log file. When we tail the log file, each individual line, what we can do is we can then send that somewhere else, which is in this case, the message queue. The workers are going to receive those event notifications from the queue and process them, and we can have multiple event consumers. So fundamentally, we've got a producer that is sending messages into a queue, and then we can have, in this case, we're going to have one consumer, but we could potentially have any number of consumers. So what you would normally do is, if the queue starts growing, you would add more consumers, and you can manage scalability that way. So back to our diagram. We've got the two Node-RED instances. One is running on the FileMaker server, and then we've got the other one that is working on a Raspberry Pi. In terms of Node-RED configuration, we do need to add a node to communicate with RabbitMQ, and we also, in this case, because we're going to be sending, the worker is going to be sending information to FileMaker, we need the FileMaker node as well. So if we say enough of the PowerPoint, so this is my FileMaker server running on AWS. It's fmserver.gempotech.com. And essentially what I've done is I've just simply imported the FileMaker log files to set up the basic structure. So we've got one table for each FileMaker log file, event, stats. It's all pretty standard stuff there. So if I just give an example, I'm going to be on my other computer, so you won't be able to see this, but I'm just going to that's actually in the way of all demos. It did not go correctly. I was trying to log in with an incorrect password. So if I just go and open recent. So basically it's told me I can't log in. And absolutely in the way of all demos, it has not worked. Very sorry about this. I was originally going to do this demo a while ago, but it got put on hold sort of due to having to take a month off. So anyway, I'll kind of dive in and show you what we're doing. So we've got a couple of instances of Node-RED, and so if I connect to my Mac Mini server, I've got a Node-RED instance running here. And fundamentally what we're doing is we're tailing the log files, we're parsing them, and then we're sending them to RabbitMQ. So has everyone actually seen Node-RED sort of to this kind of point? The idea that what we can do is we can construct flows visually, wire them together, and so forth. So what I'm doing is I basically, if I select the file, rather the tail node, what we can do is we can say we want to tail a file. In this case, that's what that one is. And so you can see what we're doing is we've got the top call stats log. And you can see that it's returning text, and we're splitting on a new line, and we're just naming this node top call stats log. What we then do is we parse it as CSV. This stage is quite important here because what we need to do is basically these right here, this matches the field names that we've got in our FileMaker database. So if we look in our, oops. Here, that if we look in top call stats, you can see that those columns match exactly the field names you've got here. And those are tab separated. And what we're then doing is using the AMQP out. So basically, this is the protocol that RabbitMQ speaks. And what we're doing is we're specifying which server it's going to. So it's going to my RabbitMQ server, which is running a pi4.transformingdigital.ai. We're sending it to a queue named FM top call stats. And that server is over here. So you can see we've got our top call stats message queue here, that we've got 301 messages in it. So this is the RabbitMQ admin console. So if we look at the overview, it just sort of shows basically how much it's processing. Fundamentally, what we've got a number of message queues. So from Node-RED, sorry, the wrong instance of Node-RED. Apologies for jumping back and forth between the different browser windows. The reason I have to do this is because this is running on my internal network. I've not yet configured SSL on everything inside the network. So because I can't get a secure connection from my Mac here to my Mac mini server for Node-RED, it won't let me make some of the configuration changes I need to on the so I've not yet worked out the security side of Node-RED and RabbitMQ, but I need to spend some time digging into SSL. So fundamentally, that what we're doing there is we're connecting the tops that in terms of security, we enter the username and password, and as you can see, I'm not using SSL or TLS, which is causing sort of this slight annoyance of having to use the different browsers. Okay, so what that's doing is that's sending, every time there's a new message on the server. So what I can do here is if I just say, which one would be good? Say access, actually, stats, sorry, if I clear this. If we wait 5 seconds, you'll see that this is a new stats log record, basically, and this is what the stats log looks like. And that's Node-RED processing it, so it's been sent to the message queue. Now, on the other side, what we're doing is we're using the AMQP in. We connect to FM stats notify, which is this queue here. And anytime anytime a message is sent to the FMstats message exchange, it's getting forwarded to the FMstats queue and the FMstats notify queue. So you can see the FMstats queue has got a bunch of unprocessed messages in it. The FMstats notify queue has got 0 because it's been processing them. So what we're doing here is we're connecting to the FMstats notify queue. You can see that the server is the same as before, and FMstats and queue. So if I just do that, I'll clear the and just deploy again. Then so you can see that's our message payload that's come from the message queue. What we're doing here is we're using the FileMaker node to connect to my FileMaker server. I specify the server with the address, what database do I want to connect to? In this case, I am using SSL. I don't want to mess with that. I specify my layout, which is stats. And what I want to do is I want to pass in the payload. And when I do that, then each time this receives a new message coming from the queue, it creates a FileMaker record on the server here. So if we look at our client stats, stats log, you can see that we're getting messages basically every 30 seconds coming through. And so the other, you can see we just received a notification. So what we've done basically is we're tailing that FileMaker log with Node-RED, using Node-RED to send that log entry as a message to the message queue. On the other side, we've got another Node-RED instance, which is functioning as a message consumer to the message queue. And it is then creating new records in FileMaker whenever it receives a new message. Now, from there, essentially what we've got is we're just basically moving the log file into another database. But where things could be much more interesting is that what we could do is that, for example, that in the event log, if we got any security warnings, we could run another process to, for example, a Python script that subscribed to that message queue could basically be looking for any security warnings and send me a text message. Or if the FileMaker, frankly, any number of things. So if a backup failed, or if if we had any sort of issues with the schedule, so we can notify. So yeah, so it's kind of at this stage, it's very much a work in progress, but I think it's going to be quite useful. And I think that for things like notifications is where it's going to be most useful. That if we had more than on the stats log, being on the lookout for if we had message, cache hit being lower, or probably more likely if we had remote calls in progress. This is my dev server, so it's doing very, very little at the moment. But if we had a lot of remote calls in progress starting to pile up, that would be the kind of thing I'd want to know about, so we could notify on that. So it's just kind of a starting point that enables a number of other things. So yeah. So does anyone have any questions? Apologies for the rather chaotic and unstructured talk.
It's something in the blood at the moment, Ian. Don't worry, mate. No, I think this is cool, and I agree. The point of grabbing, right, you're grabbing the top call stats log and stuff like that, and various bits and pieces. It's always the issue is how do you find this information? All right, we use Zabbix, so we've got we've got Zabbix installed, but I can totally see how this would work. And ironically, today it would have been flipping useful for me. I administer Lego servers, so they host everything themselves internally. And I have to go through about 4 levels of screen sharing to get onto the server. If I could have something like Rabbit running on the server that could notify me the log of the last 10 minutes somewhere else, I could then easily just go, I don't need to log in for your multi-session. I can just go look at the log and say, all right, oh, that's the reason why. And the reason why it went wrong is they did a security update and rebooted the server. So as a security method, I don't open the files automatically. So it killed their servers.
What I would probably do actually is while I'm running RabbitMQ on a Raspberry Pi here internally, because I've got a bunch of them sitting around, to be honest, in a production environment, I would probably want to have the RabbitMQ sitting on something hosted that's got an SLA where we know we could rely on it. And there are a number of companies that do that kind of hosting. But then what you'd be able to do would be use, well, I mean, Node-RED is actually really, really simple for tailing the log. I'd written JavaScript in Node before to do that, but frankly, just Node-RED made it so easy to tail the log. It's just, you just kind of drop it there, point it at the file, and it does it. So I would probably structure it that way, and then point it at the hosted message queue server. Yeah. And then, to be honest, you could have, I mean, whatever you wanted as a client as the information consumer.
And as far as the load on the server is concerned about pulling that information, if it's anything like the Zabbix agent that we use, it's just minimal on the FileMaker server, the pulling the logs. It's negligible. It probably wouldn't even blink.
I'm pretty sure that would be the case. To be honest, because it's running on my development server, I don't have any real statistics on what that would look like under load, but I think. So the one question I want to ask: when you're tallying are you just tallying the last X amount of records from the log file? Is that what you're doing, or are you bringing the whole log file in and getting Node-RED to then tally it once it's brought the whole thing in? Node-RED actually, the first time you drop it, the first time you do it, it looks like it. I think it reads the whole thing the first time.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you were doing something like that, to be honest, I think that's the kind of thing that you'd need to actually test and confirm exactly what the behavior is.
It still wouldn't be that much because the log files are capped to a certain limit and then they archive and they rotate. So that's not an issue. So the maximum is going to be is a 10 meg file. Okay, it sounds massive, but yeah, when you first start this, prepare yourself for bring the whole lot in, and then it'll tell. But the question is it should only pick up the changes since the last time it grabbed it. And if it's doing that, you're not bringing the log file in every time.
No.
When you reboot, or for some other reason you have to restart Node, it doesn't read the whole log. It's just from this point on that I become active again. Grab any new line in this log file.
Okay, so it's in effect the index is the thing that it knows the last index number it's read and then goes back and grabs everything from that index number onwards in effect.
I think it's more active than that. It says every time a new line is written to this log file, grab it, isn't it? That's what tail does.
Okay.
Because and the thing is that tail works with an open file. That's the point. So I don't think it's even reading an index.
I'm just trying to think of how I could use this, and I could certainly use it.
The other advantage of Node was that when I wrote something myself before, when it rolls over the logs, that caused me to manage those kinds of edge cases is something that they've done. Whereas I just got annoyed when I was like, oh man, I've got to go and write something to deal with renaming the, how do I do that? So it was one of those kind of the scope just expanded massively, but their tail processes in Node, kind of Node-RED, manage all that type of stuff properly.
Ian, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So let's just say, because it's great that it takes all the payloads. I'm just curious. So if a server was to go down, the FileMaker server you're monitoring in the first place,
yeah.
Do you need a payload for the rest of your setup to take action, or could you say, well, if you have not been getting a heartbeat in the last, I don't know, 3 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, then kick in with some notification?
Yeah. I mean, there'd be a number of different ways to do that. You could sort of tackle that on, because what we've got fundamentally, if I just go back to the diagram, just because it might be.
Thank you.
So on the FileMaker server, so we've got the server Node-RED. So Node-RED is tailing the log file. So what you're saying is if the FileMaker server becomes unresponsive, it's going to stop writing to the log files, presumably. So you could tackle that a couple of different ways. I mean, one way might be to, in Node-RED, and I'll be quite honest with you, I don't exactly know yet how I would do it, but if it's not received anything from the log files for a certain period of time, you would think something's gone wrong. Alternatively, you could tackle that in one of the workers that basically was looking for how long has it been since I received anything.
It depends. It depends whether it's the FileMaker server that's having a problem, as in FileMaker server, or whether it's the whole machine that's having a server.
True.
That's having a problem, because if the whole machine is having a problem, then the Node-RED can't do anything.
Yeah,
or you could lose network in between RabbitMQ and the FileMaker server. There's a bunch of things, or it could be that the server is up, but if I drill down on a variant of the same scenario, it could be that you want to say, well, anytime after you've received something that tells you that this server-side schedule started, if you don't see it come to an end by, I don't know, for 45 minutes, whatever, then I want to know about it.
Yes, because in the is it the event? Yeah, the event log has all the stuff about backups and backups completed. Yeah, so if I just go here and if I sorry, where is it? Backups. Let's say backup now. And you can just basically see the message is kind of coming in now as given actually nothing's happened on server, it was pretty quick, but so yeah, you can, there's a number of things you'd be able to do along those lines.
Nice.
I was sorry, Tony. I was just going to add. I think the thing that we do, certainly from what we're using with Zabbix has got a heartbeat system built in it, and I'm sure you can replicate that in Node-RED. That's not a problem. So I think they'll be aware of who's going right. you could create probably a workflow just to ping the server, for example, from, there's got to be a way of doing that. And then if you don't get a response back, then you escalate that to the notification service. So you could do it that way. What we pull is, we don't just pull the FileMaker server information, we pull the Windows logs, we pull some, so I wouldn't just leave it with FileMaker. If you're pulling stuff, pull the process log from the machine and bring that in as well. So then you corroborate both together. That then tells you the machine's up, but FileMaker's not reporting.
Yeah, Node-RED does have, where is it? Sorry. I was pretty sure that they had some stuff around.
Yeah, it's little things
around
like that.
VOS.
Just give me the networking heartbeat or the memory usage. And if you pull something else that's not FileMaker, if you're getting that information back, you know FileMaker stopped logging.
Yeah, because quite often actually the performance problems, just getting just the FileMaker information in isolation is what tells you there's a problem, but you don't really know where it is. It's kind of that cross correlation of different information from different sources that helps you know where, or points you in the direction where the problem might exist.
Sorry, Tony, you were going to say.
Oh, thanks. So to Robert's question, we built something which we'd actually like to move away from in some ways, or add some of, Ian, what you've done here. We have a Amazon server up there that we point emails to, and it's configured to, like, if you don't get an email with this signature, with this subject line, then say, hey. So we send the backups successes to that. But getting back to what you've done here, which I like very much, a couple of use cases. You mentioned the backup failed, which actually I like a lot because it's more immediate than what we did in terms of tracking failed backups, because you're looking straight at the log. So I just wanted to throw out a couple of things, because I've thought a little bit about this. I can't say what I've implemented and what I haven't implemented. The looking at the event log, one of the things over the years that's been kind of annoying is the too many 661s and 30s, and I think it'd be good to both tail and grep, and just say, like, okay, that's swell, because right now the interface is like turn them on or turn them off. There's no, like, I really don't want, having the 661s and the 30s optional would turn off the fire hose a little bit so I could focus on the real things. That'd be one thing. And the other thing, in the access log, I think it'd be cool if directly on the server, if you could do like a little bit of a whitelist where you're watching the access logs, and if you see something that looks suspicious in terms of somebody's coming in with a weird name or weird IP address, that it immediately says, ooh, we're getting Zoom bombed.
Actually, yeah, pardon me, that was something I did wonder about, sort of, that if doing something like that, that if a name showed up that was unfamiliar, or if a familiar name suddenly started having a lot of retries to log in, like failed login attempts, things like that are kind of out of the ordinary. But they're the kind of things you want to know about those. The faster you know about those, the better.
Well, and that's spot on, because if you're watching the log file, and I think there's a couple things to think about here, and I can see you've done. I'm thinking about, you're thinking, everybody's thinking about, like, well, what am I going to do? Because it's all business logic, and some of it's non-trivial to write. It's like, okay, I don't know what Node can do. I know what Unix can do, tail and grep and regex and whatever, and they identify the business logic and then decide where to put it. Some of it, you might throttle down on the initiating server so that you're piping less data across the network, for instance.
To be honest, in this case, with this example, where's the...
Ian, is it okay if I jump in for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Well, Gary already said that he was working with Zabbix quite a lot, and then there are some parts in FileMaker that's pretty hard to kind of touch by and get any kind of notification back on if they're actually up and running. For example, the VPE. But you can then write specific scripts towards that one to run like a PHP files. Now you get any kind of notification within Zabbix that it's working. And in Zabbix, you can decide whether you want to have a text message, a notification, an email, whatever you want, depending on what kind of errors you get, warnings, whatever you want.
I'm not.
I really encourage you all to read and take the templates from Soliant, because they are built up for FileMaker Server and for what kind of problems we have.
Yeah.
I just send along a URL that it's very useful to start off with Zabbix.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest that this sort of what I'm showing here is like a sort of a drop-in replacement for Zabbix. It's basically like a different tool that can, you know, potentially do some different things. So
I think it's a useful low weight tool. If you've got this built in AWS, and like I'm saying with my issue I've got with Lego, they may not allow me to put the Zabbix client or the agent on the machine. Now, if that port's open, if I'm reading the specification Ian right, I should be able to hit that, and it should be able to answer. Provided I can get RabbitMQ on there, then maybe that's fine. But that's probably just the same sort of question. I've still got to talk to the vendor and say, right, can I have this? Can I have Node-RED running on the server? I've got the same issue as having the Zabbix client, to be fair. So there's no real difference. I think if you own the estate and you understand what you're doing with this, I will say I agree with what Johan's saying, is that yes, the Soliant is that Soliant post that he's put in the chat is exactly where I started from. I'm not knocking that. I just took that. 99% of the work was done for me. Mm-hmm. We've done the same thing. We've then enhanced that, and then we push stuff out to our Slack. So if we get any of the key warnings, it hits our Slack notification within seconds. The team know, which is great.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
It's the same learning curve, either one. It doesn't matter which way you go. Yes, you could have that done for you, but I like the idea of the flexibility of this. I think the user interface in this is nicer to look at than Zabbix. Zabbix hasn't got the easiest user interface to do. Certainly when you're setting the hosts up, the rules and so forth, it's not as intuitive as it looks. But I think it's best for both. I think if you're a coder, we use RabbitMQ for all of our web blogging systems. So we use it, and we use it a lot. So, and yes, you're right, it does scale. We've got that on multiple hosts. We've got that on various things. So we've got levels of service on there where we're using it more than we should do in some respects. We've got it doing a load of monitoring that we're probably over killing it for what it's doing on our websites, but it has the scope and the scalability on it. But I think the important thing is if you're a coder, I think this will probably be easier to work on because you've already got the coding background. You understand the logic of this. I don't think it's best to have multiple options. That's all I'm thinking.
Yeah,
right.
there was just one. Sorry, just be 1 second. There was one thing that I just wanted to actually, one of Tony's comments, that at this point, when we tail the log, we're doing no logic at all apart from just parsing the CSV. It would probably be pretty straightforward to add something in here to do some kind of logic on it based on that parse CSV, and then do we send it or not, sort of to kind of filter and, like you said, reduce kind of the network traffic, or filter to more interesting things only. So anyway,
cool.
So a couple of things there, like Ian's showing on the screen from the, can you just turn this into CSV box in the middle? He's going out to RabbitMQ, but also to the local message payload. So the point is with Node is that you can add multiple things that all happen off the right-hand side of that middle box. So you can send the payload straight out to RabbitMQ and also do some local processing at the same time. So it isn't necessarily that everything has to be sequential. You can be also doing parallel within this. I'm doing that at the moment. And the other great thing about this is if I do something, because if I copy and paste those nodes, it's just some JSON. So I could copy and paste some nodes and send them to Ian, and he could paste them into his file and connect it up to his workflow, which is significantly easier than the, oh yeah, you go into Zabbix and you do this and you change this and you do this and you set this up. That's one of the advantages of using Node-RED. And the other being, it works perfectly on both Windows and Mac and Linux, if that's what your servers are on. So.
That's a valid point. Johan, do you know if Zabbix works on Linux? I know the agent, it works, all of it works. It works on all platforms, doesn't it?
I'd be astounded if it didn't.
Yeah, it does. It does.
It does,
it's no problem at all.
It does, but those templates don't work terribly well.
I know exactly. So they were built for Windows only, but it's really easy to kind of compare what they've done and then put it into an agent, because that's pretty straightforward. So what you need when you start a Zabbix project is a template to start off with. And what Soliant does is that they specifically did something for FileMaker servers. So if you just go ahead and look what they have done, you get a really good start. And then no matter if you're running a Mac on AWS or a Linux or a Windows machine, you will be able to use it.
One of the things I wanted to highlight on this, the reason why I moved to some sort of notification service was only because FileMaker took away the notification of a failed backup. So we used to get that automatically in the server. Now we don't. It's like, hold on a sec.
Well,
so
if want to know that.
Successfully, I get no notification. No, you've got to plug in something else. So that's the only reason why I looked at a log of monitoring. I agree. What I ended up getting out of it is this sort of technology opens the can of worms of the things of you go, right, now I know I can grab the access log. Now I can grab the top call stats log is invaluable. If you're trying to debug a server and you don't know where the problem is, it's totally invaluable. And monitoring that is a bloody nightmare because it brings up so much data in it. So any tool you can do to analyze the log file is useful. Whether it's someone, and I know, I can't remember who it was, but someone created a FileMaker database that read the CSV in and just turned it into at least a searchable database for you. So even that's better than nothing than a text file. So I think there's a situation for any of these technologies to be used, and it depends on what your flavor is, really.
So I'm using it. I'm not quite doing what Ian's doing. I'm doing some other stuff, but the admin server console login, you can be notified anytime anybody logs into the admin server console. So if somebody else has a password, you know that somebody else is in there, for instance. One of the other things is having instant notification that somebody's not put in the right password. I have a customer who frequently does something. I've told him what to do and he frequently does it wrong. And then I get a notification straight away. I use Prowl, as you know, my big thing. To get notified instantly when somebody brand new logs into his system and I know it hasn't been set up, and I can send them a text saying, "Dear so-and-so, remember you have to do this first." And he goes, "Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot." He does it every time. But it's like, the thing about Slack is anything else like that is it's about instant notification, isn't it? So what Ian's showing is you want to know if something has happened, and the something is not everything. It's in certain circumstances. Has this happened because actually I should do something about this, or I should know about it? And that's what these systems are doing for us, is saying something that was previously hidden away, we can get it pretty much instant notification, which is a great thing.
Exactly, and this is a really good example of when we need to use these kind of features. I don't know if you're all aware of it, but for FileMaker Server 19.3.2, there is a memory leak for the VPE engine, which is causing it to crash after a certain time. And you need to be having a really heavy traffic for that to happen. But with Zabbix or other tools like the one Ian just showed us, you're able to restart that one and make it up and running automatically. So you don't have to take an action by yourself. You can actually just switch it off, like disabling and enabling it again, and then it's up and running in a few seconds. So by taking the errors that you get from the logs, you're able to do some kind of actions automatically, and you're up and running again. It's really crucial for heavy traffic service that we all have. So making sure that all parts of the service is up and running.
Have you ever had that, Johan, where you've restarted a service and then the server hasn't fully come back up, if you see what I mean? So
yeah, but it can then one of the things I've done in Zabbix that I check to make sure that it's up and running, and if it's not running, I'm just restarting it again, and then it usually goes up the second time. But it's happened, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because that's what I found is sometimes there's an underlying problem that service now is just knackered. It just won't start, and then it's that point of getting notified. Right, now I've tried it 2 or 3 times. It's not come up. What do I do? Well, kick everyone. Let's reboot the server now because we got no other option. So it's the point, and that fixes everything, as we know. Turn it off, turn it on again is the one IT fix that fixes absolutely everything. So that's where you got to go. But at least you've got some sort of monitoring before it goes critical. And I think that's the important thing. And it depends on what you're doing with your servers. If it's a login system for a front reception, if it went down for a little period of time, it's probably not critical and that much of a problem. But if it's running your whole business, I agree, any of these tools, if you haven't got a monitoring tool for your log files, and I wonder how many people are on this chat, there's 23 people still here. I wonder how many of you have deployed a solution into a client and then gone, job done, I've been paid, thank you very much, and walked away. Some of you will, some of you won't, but you'll know about it when you get that call from the client going, system's gone down. And I had exactly that today. So where they phoned me up and said, this has gone down. I said, okay, give me a second. I checked the log file. Within seconds, I know what's happened. And you've got to have these monitoring tools. If it has to stay up, you've got to put the tools in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about 10 years ago when I was at Cordis. I mean, what we did actually was we had monitoring on all of our client servers. So generally, we knew their server was in trouble before they did. So when the client phoned up, there was frequently somebody was already started, had already started looking into it.
Exactly. There is one single thing they can't really handle when it goes down like that, John. Gary, that is if you have one of those WebDirect users where they don't log out and they got stuck and they're stuck in the memory, and you're using working machines and they're stuck on one of the working machines, then the load balancer of FileMaker Server on the master machine will just stop adding new connections, which mean you eventually have to disconnect that working machine to get the server up and running again. And that is not done in any kind of automation. You need kind of really disconnect it. Then you can get up and running again.
Thankfully, I've not had that. And I don't want it. It sounds horrible.
Yeah.
Does that only work if you're on multi-server deployment?
Exactly. It has to be in multi-server. And then since you can have up to 5 now, some of the solutions that we have are rather big and have a lot of users. So I've had almost 1,000 users without problem for months. And then occasionally it just happened that one user, for some reason, doesn't get disconnected. And then you have that problem.
Oh, okay.
So I have a question for the group here. We did spin up a Zabbix server. We're not too deep into it. We got it up. We put it on a 1 gigabyte. Is that the right RAM? And I think we had a more recent version of Zabbix, so it's kind of bumping on memory. We're very sad because we might have to spend more money. But that all said, so I got a tiny bit of experience with Zabbix. I think I got an understanding of what Ian presented here. So we think these technologies are complementary, like having both is good, because some of them, it looks like this node stuff. Anyway, it seems complementary. Is this an easy install? Are there any massive dependencies?
What do you mean by Zabbix or?
No, this one, this.
Yeah, that's to respond to that one.
With Node?
Yeah, I mean, is it baked in? You don't have to install Java, right?
No. It's actually, John can probably explain better than I can.
Well, it depends how you run the installer, Tony, here's the truth. Clearly, it's a graphical interface for Node, which is a JavaScript self-contained thing. So you have to somewhere have Node installed. The installer may install it for you, but obviously it's dependent in that sense on that. But I can't see that there's anything else.
So basically it's an installer. It installs some sort of, whatever the heck it's called these days, engine, yes. JavaScript engine, but it's not, it doesn't have the licensing complexities of Java, right?
No. The biggest difficulty in my experience in the last few months is finding out how to make it start automatically on Linux, because you only ever go into Linux via a session, and of course when the session stops because you log out and turn it off, then there's a way to do it, but you have to find out how to make Node-RED start all by itself and not on the basis of the session. but that's only on Linux.
And John, I like what you said about the ability to pass code around relatively easy, and perhaps also that it's that those modules work across platforms. So because we have
100%. It's not so. What Ian showed on the left hand side, those kind of coloured boxes. So some of those are the built-in node boxes, and as Ian said, you have to get or download into it the RabbitMQ ones and the FileMaker ones, which Louis wrote. But that dark blue ones at the bottom are the operating system ones, which is also imported. So you can import a set of these kind of widgety things, but there's an easy method of doing that. So as long as you have the same set of things in your Node-RED, I can literally send you the JSON that is describing that thing in the middle, and you could have it running. Now, clearly, you have to set up your own servers and your own passwords and that kind of stuff. But the actual functional parts, where it's just using totally native stuff, there's no difference between any of the platforms. So if you're running this on Windows and I created something on Linux, I could send it to you and it would work.
Yeah, well, that's a huge productivity. So you don't have to write PowerShell for one platform and shell scripts for the other. And
correct.
That's very cool.
No, yeah.
Tony,
John, does that mean you could?
Just to add to your thing of sorry, to add to your thing about your Zabbix server, we run 4 server logs into ours, and we've got a 2 CPU. But I've just checked the stats on it; it barely touches 50%. I could probably knock a CPU out of it. So 1 CPU, but we got 2 gig of RAM. I would just put 2 gig of RAM against your server, and you'll be fine for everything.
Yeah.
And as is a full transactional system that's running everything in our company. So I would imagine it depends on where you put it and what you're doing, but I would imagine it'll easily do that if you put 2 gig of RAM on it, and it'll be fine.
Buy Amazon stock.
Yeah.
Actually go back in time and then buy it.
John, I had a question for you. Does that effectively mean you could write a template for some of this stuff and distribute it to whoever you wanted to distribute it to?
Yes, absolutely.
That's brilliant.
That's how I started.
So John, that's for the next session, yeah?
Potentially. Well, so it's interesting. I said to Ian when he was going to present it the other time, I'm interested in seeing this because somebody else has done something different with it, with the piece in the middle. I've chosen a slightly different path. But the point is, you're always looking for new ways of extending your knowledge. And literally, if Ian did an export from that and sent me the JSON and I just put RabbitMQ in and set some things up, I could have the same stuff as he's got working. Or I could, rip some other stuff out and just say, well, I'll have those nodes and see what you're doing about how are you splitting out the JSON, how are you doing, because I am doing that in a single Node-RED. But I could copy and paste that and send it to Ian and say, well, just play with this and you could do this. And I'm pushing to both Prowl and Pushover, which is a subscription message service, but it's like really cheap for iOS. So you just get instant messaging rather than, because I don't use Slack for that kind of stuff. So, Ian, I'm really interested in I think the advantage of using a queue system is that you just push things into the queue and then walk away and let the queue system deal with it. That's the advantage of doing that. You just fill it up like a big bucket. It's the Amazon bucket model, isn't it? But what is your perception of the time penalty for pushing to a queue rather than processing it instantly? So,
well, I mean, one of the things about pushing it to the queue basically is that it does get you kind of that decoupling, and that you can process things asynchronously.
Yeah, no, I get that.
So if you wanted, for example, to do something that involves doing something silly like sending an email every time you've got a log entry, running that locally is going to be, it's not going to scale. Whereas doing it from a message queue, you could add multiple workers and it's going to work just fine. So RabbitMQ is written in a language called Erlang, which was designed for high availability systems. Well, it was originally designed to work on telephone systems that like have to work and have to be available.
Yeah. So
it's really is designed to be a properly high availability and scalable system. And it all seems very, very quick. I mean,
we use Rabbit purely for all of our queue systems for the, as I said, for the website. So like, for example, if we get a delivery of comics in on the beginning of a week, we may have to inform 30, 40,000 customers that that's arrived. So we just whack that straight to the queue system. Therefore, if then we're then using, I can't remember what we're using for our messaging service for email, but if that messaging service for email goes down, doesn't matter, we've just added it to queue, it's just in the queue, it's just not processed. So that's the point of the flexibility. You've relinquished your task from the servers or whatever it is to push it into the queue. Once it's in the queue, if the ancillary systems that it's then calling foul, it just stays in the queue because it fouled. It will schedule it when it comes back up. So yes, I agree, John. There's a point that there may be the point that if you've got a load in the queue and there's a critical notification in that queue, it's got to process the other stuff before it gets to that. So there is that risk. There is certainly that risk for something that you want to go, I want to be notified straight away. But then if the notification system fail, when they come back online, they will then notify you. It's better than forgetting and failing.
Yeah, you can deal with that sort of by prioritization of them. So I mean, but yeah, certainly your point is true.
I've also just been playing with using Amazon's queue service as well for the same reason.
Yeah,
that you want the queue to have 100 as far as possible 100% availability. The issue with Amazon is how to deal with it's the Lambda part of getting the stuff out that's not as simple as what Ian's shown us tonight in terms of starting to write your own lambdas in JavaScript is somewhat head scratching. But
if you're saying that, John, the rest of us have got no chance.
No, I've made it work, to be fair, but, but it wasn't simple.
Yeah, to be honest, most of the stuff I'm doing with the Amazon message queue, I'm actually not mostly I've sort of mostly stopped writing sort of using Lambda, and actually I've got a sort of, it's either hosted on DigitalOcean or Heroku, but using the Amazon message queue, well, the simple queue service, which is, it's not as fully featured, but it, to be honest, the use cases I'm dealing with, it doesn't need to be really fully featured. I'm just after some basic, just kind of make it run asynchronously and be reliable.
It's a timely discussion as well, though, because if anybody saw the FMBug presentation from the other week, Todd is about to start pushing the whole idea of pub sub within FileMaker as this is something we should all be considering doing, which is essentially going, here's the thing, push it to a queue and let the queue do the other thing. And there's some very interesting use cases beyond just messaging. If you employ that approach, one of the use cases is something's happened in. So you're saying something's happened in a log. I want to be notified in it. If you just, so you've got a producer at one end that's pushing something, but if the producer is FileMaker itself saying, I just did something which I need to notify the queue about, so that some other file somewhere else needs to do something with that information. As in, that's a way to decouple systems. So you could, so where you have a big legacy system, you can write something that's a little agile FileMaker process, and it says, oh, do this, push this to a queue, and then lets the queue go into the legacy system. So that it's a much bigger model than just take the log file and have a Slack message about it.
And I mean, you've probably heard about systems like Kafka, and it's kind of, it's that on a much larger scale, where the idea is that what you've got is kind of that basically the source of truth for the data is kind of the event stream in a giant message queue, and the fact that whether it's in a database or not is kind of irrelevant. That event, the existence of the event stream in a message queue that is persistent, just you could take that and recreate the state of the system.
But I think it's the issue about the change of thinking that's coming with where FileMaker may be going in the future, is that we're going to have to start considering that as a methodology, this is something that we could learn from and improve our development.
Well, in the Q&A session where, so I cannot remember his name, but the technical
Peter Nelson.
Peter, when he was talking about eventual consistency, that's fundamentally what this is. Basically, you're saying that we're sending a message or an event into some kind of queue. We know that it's going to be persisted, but we don't know exactly when. It might be immediately, it might be 5 seconds from now, but it will get there.
Yeah, the presentation in the LA group, FM Disc, right, that John mentioned was a very good one, and it's recorded, it's up. A lot of use cases, including inventory, where you want to update inventory, which is stored, but it's record locks and stuff like that. So the log just keeps on going, the queue, until push until it succeeds. Worth watching.
Yeah. Actually, I'm not sure if Stathis is still on the call, but we were discussing doing something very like that.
I'm here.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, we were kind of discussing doing something along those lines for stock to an extent.
Yeah, I've seen it work. I didn't set it up. I was on a project and someone set it up, and 130 users. So they had, they needed to do something record locking. So they used a queue, and they also used it for sending emails with PDFs, basically, just to get it, let everybody get to work, send the email, and then they'd hand it off to the queue, and the server was running on a loop. Apple script these days might be an on trigger, whatever that's called, and then the person would just see the email would go out, and it would pop up in a portal, and just basically offloading from the desktop to the server.
Yeah,
good stuff.
Yeah, the only thing with queues that, from my experience, we always need to have in mind and design is what happens when your routine starts before the previous one has ended, which is probably something you don't plan at the very beginning.
I agree with that. And one of the sessions I was going to do, which I always have on the back burner, is our bot system that we run. We do exactly that. So we have something like 250, 300 tasks that run throughout the day. So we have a bot management system that it does exactly that. So we have control modules. So when we set the scripts up, we have a control module to say this is a parent script. The parent script can then run the child scripts. But you can never run the child scripts on their own because you need the parent script to run. So therefore you've got your process always then completing in order. So it's one of the sessions I'll do at next event, then when I'm going to go for our bots and do that. We don't like running perform scripts on server. A lot of you do, I know, but I just don't like the not being able to see what's going on. So when some of our scripts are taking, as I mentioned in the earlier news section, we got some scripts that are taking 5-6 hours to run. You want to know where that script is. If you do that on a perform script on server, you're just hoping that finishes. So that's why we use a bot system. We started for that reason, and we've continued it going forward. But I'll do a session at probably the next event where I'll go through the bot system that we've created, because I think that will help with certainly that automation process. So, and that falls straight into this as the point of a queuing system. It's exactly that. So we've done the queuing system in FileMaker. So it's the same thing. So.
Yeah. Gary, when you say a bot system, you mean like a robot? Like
yeah, so we've got 3 or 4 Mac Minis that are permanently running. They run 24/7.
I like that too. I like to see what's going on.
And then that way you can just jump in at any point. You can control that system, just chuck it in debug mode, and then that's it. You can be halfway through a script. You can see where it is, what it got to, where the issues were. And then we needed a management system to do all the tasks that we're doing. So I'll go through that. As I say, I'll talk to Jul, and next session I'll do a session on our bots so we can go through that for everyone.
Yeah, great idea. I think
Okay.
this is probably quite a
Sorry,
good
actually,
point to. Sorry, did
one
you want to say
sec.
something? Ian? Go on.
Yeah, sorry. I've just seen a couple of questions from James Kelly had asked that I'd not seen those before. About basically, could that be done on 1 or 2 cloud servers? Yes, it could. Absolutely. What I've done here is running on a Mac Mini, which is a FileMaker server, and a single Raspberry Pi. So yeah, cloud server is no problem at all. And also our Node-RED and Rabbit MQ, both open source. Yes, they are. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Excellent. I think, I mean, if people have more questions about this and you're staying for the virtual bar, Ian, we could run over into that. But otherwise, I think we need to wind this one up now for the moment,
Okay,
and
cool.
move on to the next thing. Ian, thank you very much. That was a really great and clearly thought-provoking talk, because it generated a lot of questions there. And it was really good to see, effectively, I think John mentioned it briefly, a response to John's original talk when he said, let's see some other applications of it. So it's good to see those starting to happen. So many thanks, Ian, and to John for your earlier talk.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want to do the Q&A? Is there any questions? Because I know I posted one to test, Jul. You can read it out if you want. I don't mind.
I'll have to find it now.
Was there a question from anyone else, or?
Yeah, ask whilst I'm doing this.
Yeah, was there any questions anyone wanted to throw on the table? So if you didn't fill the form in, you've got a question, don't be shy. Just ask. If anyone's got any. If no one does anything, I'll assume
if no one has,
so knowledgeable and you know everything.
And if no one has, I'll ask Gary's question.
Oh, go on then. As I said, it was a test question. I can't even remember what I asked. So.
You said, what's faster to fill? A field across 10 million records, replace, or loop?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
One of your favorite questions, I think.
Go on then. I put it out to the group because I'm not 100% sure.
I guess replace.
I'll post it in the chat so everyone can refer to it. How do I post to chat to?
So Ed reckons replace, and I don't know. The point is I've not tested it. I don't know if anyone's tested it.
Just from my work with scheduling stuff, I was making a system where you've got your tasks in a schedule that it generates the list and then goes through and adds them to a new table, etc. When I was doing test runs, replace was on average faster, even with only like 60 to 100 records, than a loop was. So I think that might scale up as it gets larger.
Did your loop have freeze window?
Yeah.
Okay. Was your loop running perform scripts on server?
Not on server, no. Client side. Although client on the server and then client.
That's exactly what I think it was. Phil's just mentioned. So I'm stealing your thunder, Phil. Sorry, mate.
So that would be my guess. I've had good experiences with loop and bad experiences, and most of the time I find that it just is always a little bit slower.
But it does give you error capture though.
So yeah, yes, that's a big benefit.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the pros and cons of it for me.
Yeah, and Gary.
Sorry, Robert. I know for a fact that the fastest method to replace that big found set is using import records. And actually, the cool thing about import records is you can define whether some other auto-enter calculations, if you have, they trigger. So if you export 10 million times the same word and then import it, it's probably going to be the faster way to achieve your result.
I also ended up moving over to export import rather than standard replace for the scheduling bit as well. So
it also depends on what data you're importing and whether indexing is on, because there's a difference between importing 10 million times the same word and 10 million times a sentence that's where the index is on.
Yeah.
And also 10 million records of a calculation, John.
That's going to slow things down a fair bit, I guess.
Sorry, I just want to throw that one in there.
That also was my question, because like if the replace is referring to some record level based information to take place, then you cannot really import that data in, you know. But if you just have something that you want to replace with the same value across the whole set, then I think import will win hands down.
Right, let me give you some more context then. So I've got every store. So if I've got 10 stores and I've got sales data in that store, yeah? And then I've got a field that is group total. How do I set the group total? That's my point. And I can't have it as a calc for obvious reasons. I wouldn't put a calc in the system ever again, to be fair. I don't think anyone should use calc. The FileMaker should turn it off. But the point is if that's the point and you got that, and I've got a history of 3 years worth of transactional data I need to set. It might be 10 million, might be 5 million, might be 200 records, depends if we've got a pandemic, it might be no records. But the point is that's what I'm looking at. So I've got a sum of 10 fields. Do I do a set field on a loop, or do I do a replace? And that's the thing. And by the way, if you haven't got the answer, I'll test it and I'll come back next time and tell you what the answer is, because I'm not sure either.
You know, I had a really good answer, and Gary just kind of blew it up a little bit. I'll go with it anyhow.
Sorry.
Is when you're doing a beauty contest between a replace and a looping set, one of the optimizations that I think is awesome is if you're on a record and you're about to set a field with a value, it's good to wrap it with an if. If the field is the same as what you're about to set it to, you know, you just only set it if you have to. And I think that gives you a little bit of a speed bump. Well, I know it gives you a speed bump. And that might actually put looping set a nose ahead of the replace, depending on the data. Although, Gary, your example basically destroys my entire use case. But that all said, I like the loop and set. I think it scales better if you're setting multiple fields. And it also, somebody else said it, gives you the error capture, which gives you the ability to know if you failed or you didn't fail. But anyway, kick all the other users out, it's different.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on Tony's answer. I have a client with IT on SQL servers. They don't have direct access, so they get these feeds. And I have to bring that data into FileMaker, and I'm not going to replace every single value in every single field when I import. I'm just going to do it based on this has changed. And it's pretty fast when I do it, perform script on server.
Cool.
Yeah, it's night and day, because you know you're already reading is faster than writing.
There's one other caveat I'd add to this, just to extend it even further, because I just always like to. One little thing is, if you start based on coming back to what this one of our sessions was with the Node-RED monitoring the servers, what Johan said about Zabbix, do a replace on that amount of records and then watch your server tank. That's the one thing I will say. This is where I find a loop. So we've played with loops. So if you're doing that level, you could say loop through, and every 10,000, do a commit and a pause for 10 seconds. Reason for that commit and pause will free your server up to do some other tasks. You go and start that replace, you will then lock your server until that replace finishes. That's a task that won't ever stop. So if you do it and it takes 6 hours, good luck. So, so just bear that in mind by the complexity. So it all comes down to many parameters, that questions. I deliberately asked the question vague to start with for that obvious reason, to provoke conversation. But that's the whole point is, I think everyone needs to look at, if you are looking at this as an idea of which is faster, you've got to put it in context of what you're using. And what Beverly said about like bringing in a whole bunch of data from a SQL server, well, yeah, there's no point setting everything to set what you need. But there are some mitigating factors to this that you have to consider. And it's just a matter of scale. I don't know that I would love, Jul, are we going to get a FileMaker representative here at some point in the future? Because we used to have them and now they don't.
Well, yeah, I think we should do.
Because that's a question I would love to ask a tech person from FileMaker. You tell me which one's faster. Surely you should know under the hood which is better.
I think that's a really good idea. I think we should reach out and see if we can get a tech person.
Yeah, I think we've got to start doing that, because we used to have representatives from FileMaker here and we haven't for a while now. So
yeah, I'm happy to wrap up. I said a lot of it already. Thanks everyone for coming, and special thanks particularly to Damon and Ian for contributing and putting themselves out there and telling us some really interesting stuff. We're going to move to the virtual bar now, pretty much smoothly and straight away. Drink recommended, obviously, but maybe it's 2 a.m. where you are and you don't feel like having a drink, but whatever.